of the things that really came into view pretty recently for me was this heretic Marcion. He was this guy who got things start off on the wrong foot very early on in the church. By 144, the early church had considered him a heretic, and yet his influence went on for hundreds of years after that. So much so that there was this guy named Mar Abba who was crossing the Tigris River, who came upon a Jewish man, Joseph Moses, and he asked him, this guy was Jewish, he said, "Are you a Christian or a Jew?" And he said, "Well, you know, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, and I believe in Messiah." And he was like, "How could you say that?" Because in his mind, a Christian was someone who was a Marcionite. All right, so who is this guy, Marcion? Marcion is the man who gave us terms like Old Testament, New Testament. He was rabidly anti-Jewish. He, in fact, said that the Old Testament was given to the Jews by a demiurge, like not the real God, and then it was the real God who sent Jesus to free mankind from this awful legal system that the demiurge had put the Jews under. His only apostle was Paul. Nobody else was considered worthy, and so only the writings of Paul were considered to be authentic. And, you know, as I was doing this research, I'm like, I've heard this sermon before. I've heard this so many times on Sundays that, you know, Paul this, Paul that, haven't you read the book of Galatians? And all these different ideas. And I'm like, it all goes back to Marcion.
Oh, that is incredible. You know, and this is why, you know, I've stated long ago, I said, only when you can find where Paul is quoting from the Torah and the prophets, only then do you know that you have Paul in context, because you cannot put Paul in the context of Gentile churchianity. He was a Pharisee. He was the son of a Pharisee. He was raised at the feet of Gamaliel. He knew the difference between the instructions in the Torah and the instructions of the rabbis. This is something that he was well aware of. But, you know, Marcion, you know, this guy was a total blithering idiot.
Sadly, but he was an idiot with a tremendous amount of influence. And I recently did a study called Haunted Theology, the Ghost of Marcionism. And I kind of use this motif of haunted theology because, you know, when you think about a haunted house, it's perceived as being inhabited by disembodied spirits of the deceased who may have been former residents. And I kind of see that we have a similar type of theology when we look at Marcionism, that he's the ghost who has been haunting our theology. And most people have never heard of Marcion. Your average pastor has not heard of Marcion. He's not, you know, one of the more flamboyant, you know, cult leaders or heretics that are out there. But he's so important because he has colored our thinking on so much of our theology.
So Marcion and what he taught has so permeated Christianity. And, you know, I sometimes call it Western churchianity, you know, what came out of Rome and you know, finally made it over into our culture now, which has driven the stake between the Christian world and the Jewish world, where they say some of the same words, but they mean two different things by those words. We have to redefine our terms and get back to a biblical definition of terms.
Absolutely. I was in a church service where the pastor was teaching, and he was in Colossians chapter 2, where, you know, it says that the commandments that were against us have been taken out of the way. They've been nailed to the cross. All right, and so I went and asked him later, I said, are you saying that the very words that God spoke at Mount Sinai, the Torah, are you saying that was nailed to the cross? And he's like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And you know, and so there's all these memes out there on the internet. For example, Jesus nailed the old law to the cross. Jesus was the end of the law, of course, taken from Romans 10:4. And that the law of Moses has been abolished, all these different ideas. And so people are very, very adamant that the laws given at Mount Sinai by God himself, that those are somehow only for the Jews. Those have been taken out of the way and nailed to the cross.
Right. And then later on, it says, by doing so, you follow the doctrines and commandments of men. And so they're equating the doctrines and commandments of men with the commandments of Almighty God.
Right.
That is absolutely ridiculous. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinance that was against us. This is rabbinic Judaism, the man-made rules and regulations of the Pharisees. The very laws that Yeshua broke, he broke their laws, he didn't break the Torah, and that's what ended nailing him to the cross. So Yeshua, in effect, by that, okay, you're going to kill me because I'm breaking your rules and regulations? I'm going to nail those rules and regulations. They are going to be nailed to my cross, and I'm going to triumph over them because his resurrection from the dead showed that their rules and regulations had no authority. Just like with every miracle he did, from the healing the man that was lame for 38 years, and telling him to break the law of the Eru by picking up his bedroll and walking, or defiling the Pharisees' ceremonial stone water pots at the wedding in Canaan. Every miracle that he did, nearly every one can be documented that he is deliberately and vehemently violating rules and regulations that the Pharisee religious leaders had put in place. Those were the handwriting of ordinances against us, not the commandments of God. But this is what it's turned into. So you're saying this goes right back to Marcion.
Right back to Marcion. Yeah, it really goes right back to this guy. And so, I in the study, I show that, it's good to have a good a sample. You want to, when you're doing a scientific study, you want to have a baseline.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so I go through and I show from book after book after book where God says that my commandments are good. And then when we get to Marcion, we begin to realize that here's the guy that, again, he gave us the Old Testament and the New Testament. He gave us those very terms come from Marcion, right? And then the early heresiologists were really trying to stamp out Marcion from their perspective. They were trying to get rid of his ideas, but he was so prevalent that they were not able to stamp him out. And so years later, even hundreds of years later, they were still trying to get rid of the influence of Marcion. And so we can hear Tertullian, he talks about the separation of law and gospel, which this was Marcion's primary concern. So he says the separation of law and gospel is the primary and principal exploit of Marcion. His disciples cannot deny this, which stands at the head of their document, that document by which they are inducted into and confirmed in this heresy, for such are Marcion's antitheses, or contrary oppositions, which are designed to show the conflict and disagreement of the gospel and the law. So again, very early on, and so this is Tertullian, this is several hundred years after Marcion, and yet the influence is still very poignantly felt. Irenaeus goes into a very similar diatribe against Marcion. They wrote entire tomes trying to denounce Marcion. And so you might get the impression, well, it must be Marcionism died away. I don't think so. I think what happened is that Marcionism sort of went underground and was assimilated into the very bread and butter of Christianity. And the warp and the woof, it just kind of became part of the texture. And so that now, when we look back and we say, yeah, the law is terrible, where does that idea come from? From Marcionism. Okay. And that's why it's so hard to spot.
Well, let me ask you, Doug, where does this, you say Marcion was one who coined the terms Old Testament and New Testament, but the word New Testament, every time it appears in the New Testament, it's really a mistranslation, because this goes back to Jeremiah. I will make not a New Testament, but a new covenant with the house of Israel
and the house of Judah.
And the house of Judah.
Exactly.
And what is this? It's literally a renewed covenant, is it not?
Well, it's an interesting question, because what I would see is that God actually married Israel at Mount Sinai. And that was the quote-unquote old covenant, if you will. And the old covenant, the old marriage contract is distinct from the Torah, from the instructions. Think of it like this. You get married to your wife, and you have some vows that you say at your wedding. Let's say, God forbid that your wife is not faithful, and you divorce her because she's not faithful. And then you marry someone else. You might use the very same vows, because there was nothing wrong with the vows. The vows were good. And so I see the vows are kind of like the instructions. They're like the Torah. And so that's how we can have a new covenant, a new marriage contract, with the same vows, the same Torah instructions, if you will, even though we now have a new marriage contract.
Okay, well, let's explore that a little bit. It's okay. So this new covenant would be the Torah written on their hearts.
Right.
Right? So if we wanted to put a terminology to Christianity, it would be those upon who the covenant was written upon their hearts.
Yes.
And so they no longer have enmity against God's commandments and God's covenant. They've been like a new man. It's been renewed, and in the same covenant that was presented at Mount Sinai, where we were offered to be priests and kings, now is being offered to us, and it's written on our heart.
Right.
And so those who do not have, and I would assert this, those who do not have the Torah written on their heart, those who do not want to keep the commandments of God, I would have to say that according to the standard of the Scripture, they are not a new covenant believer. They're not even in the category of what would be called a Christian, unless it could be called a Marcionite. But as far as a follower of Yeshua, a follower of the way, they don't even qualify, because the Torah isn't written on their heart. There's something wrong deep in their soul.
Yeah.
Something is missing.
And this is...